Good morning, I'm Connor Darwish, and when analyzing the question to what extent has social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram affected the spread of racist values in the African American community in the United States, I was able to develop the claim that the widespread use of social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram have actually acted as a catalyst increasing the spread of racism in the African American community since the print media times of the civil rights movement. To analyze this in a larger context, we must first see that in a poll done by SurveyMonkey NBC News, which was applied through the Pace and Raven test, 64% of Americans say that racism remains a major problem. This is significant because only 58% of citizens turned out to vote in the 2016 election. What this means is that a majority of our country more thinks that racism is a major problem than willing to come and vote in an election to determine the next leader of the free world. Going back to the civil rights movement and the journalists of the time, we must first analyze that journalism and print media were in fact racist, even though they never actually said something that could be perceived as a racist comment. We can analyze this by journalism professor and Southern Methodist University professor Craig Flerney, who writes that if you picked up a white newspaper, you as a black person didn't exist. Basically meaning that in a white newspaper, there were no records of black people being born, going to high school, graduating high school, going to college and graduating college, getting a job, or dying. This is significant because you could only make it into a white person newspaper as a black person if you were famous like Joey Lewis or Louis Armstrong, or if you committed a crime. So when it came to the civil rights movement, there was little to any coverage at all, providing one side of the story just because you were black, which is perceived racism. Such examples can be these headlines that I found of print media of white newspapers, such as 3,000 will burn Negro, or John Hartfield will be lynched. This is racist comments that can be made by a newspaper. Moving forward, we can see that the only true way that racist values were shared in an equal light were through the Letters of Birmingham Jail published by Martin Luther King Jr., who wrote that beyond this, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. There can be no gainslaying of the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community. These letters provided an actual true story and an actual true example of how racism has affected the African American community. Though, when Martin Luther King tried to get these letters published, he turned to Harvey Shapiro from the New York Times, who agreed with him and said that these letters should be published to provide a fair story. Though, when Mr. Shapiro tried to publish these letters in the New York Times, he was unable to persuade his superiors at the magazine to print it because he was black. This is racism because they were unable to publish the true story and the true actual events that were happening just because of the color of Martin Luther King's skin. Moving forward into the 21st century, I analyzed Dr. Edward Kessler's work on the social media and the movement ideas. Dr. Edward Kessler talks about how there are over 800 million active users on Facebook, who more than 50% log on to Facebook every single day. Now, what's significant about this is that 75% of these users are global, but 25% reside in the United States, meaning that there are 200 million active Facebook users in the United States. And social media and these 200 million active Facebook users is significant because Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube enable users to communicate, engage, and create content and information at levels of speed that we have never seen before from the print media times. You can click and share any news without it being fact-checked, approved by superiors, or even being published, meaning that more and more people can engage in communication without little to no fact-checking. Moving forward, we can analyze that racial comments can be made from this. I analyzed 2 Facebook posts that show a level of racism that existed back in 2008 towards Michelle Obama, who was then becoming the First Lady. The first post says, "The poor gorilla." The second post, "I admire gorilla more than I admire her. Wait, I forgot, she is a gorilla." This wasn't fact-checked. It wasn't approved by a superior. It was just clicked, made, and shared without little to no pushback of racial discrimination comments. Anita M. Samuels writes that the ability to share comments online via Twitter, Facebook, etc. has vastly enhanced, proving that social media has vastly enhanced the racial comments. Though technology journalist Robert Anthony further comments on how it's increased since the print media times when he says that it used to take a slow cut and paste procedure, now requires a click or two of a share. What we can see is that it's become easier to call out and share racist comments, whether you wanted to attack and share the racist comments, or whether you just wanted to spread them further. Moving forward, we can also see in a larger perceived context that this just doesn't affect the United States. This is also affecting a global scale. Louise P. Trinidad further comments that in the past 15 years, hate speech, racism, and varied forms of bigotry have also been on the rise. A clear example of this is actually found in Brazil. A policy brief analyzed 3 situations of perceived racism on social media. The policy brief comments that number 1, upperly mobile Black Brazilian women aged 20 to 35 years old are 81% of the victims of racist discourses online. Number 2, 2/3 of the analyzed cases of racism on social media had no prior relationship with the person making the racial comments, proving that these comments were made just to be made. And number 3, hateful social media posts tend to keep attracting new and more users, showing that when these comments are made, it makes people feel good about themselves, and they are attracting more and more people, analyzing that my claim is in fact correct, that social media is actually acting as a catalyst. And we can see that it also has provided a bigger perspective and a bigger perceived notion in the context, because while this is happening in the United States, it's also happening in other countries such as Brazil. So when we look at the problems of racism, what are the solutions that we can come upon to help fix the problem? The first possible solution identified, and probably the best solution we can have, is to create education programs for our youth to accept everyone and lower racist bullying, such as the DARE programs with drug awareness. And the second possible solution we identified is to create congressional oversight of social media platforms. So when we see a level of discrimination or a racial comment made that could be perceived as racist, we can have congressional oversight to remove those Facebook posts, those Instagram posts, or those Twitter posts. Though in the identification of limitations, the first possible one is a First Amendment argument. So if we are removing Facebook posts from social media, we have to argue that we are actually violating their First Amendment or the right to freedom of expression, as it hasn't caused any physical harm. The other possible solution identified is parent pushback. When we see parents who are already racist and impose those racist values on their children, when we create these educational programs, we might receive parent pushback from parents who don't want to engage in those levels of communication with their children. With that, thank you, and what questions do you have?
All right, I have 2 questions for you, Connor. First up, what information did you need before you began your research?
Well, to even just start the idea of showing how social media acted as a catalyst, I first needed to find actual studies, such as the Black Brazilian Women Study Policy Brief of Brazil, to actually prove that there has been an increased levels of racism in the African American community.
If you had more time, what additional research would you do?
Well, if I had additional time, I would like to research more about the civil rights movement, and I would like to find even more studies. We were able to find a lot of comments by professors and by historians to prove that these newspapers were racist and that they did practice forms of racism, but we were not able to provide actual studies or detailed policy briefs such as the Black Brazilian policy brief I mentioned.